Commander Zethkar sat in his observation chair, watching the stars through the clear metal walls of his ship. His forearms moved across the control panels with practiced ease. The ship was completely invisible to everyone else in space. That was the point. His job was to watch, not to be seen. The message screen in front of him showed his new orders. Another boring assignment. Another species to watch and study. This time it was humans. Zethkar had heard of them before, but not much. They were new to space travel, very new. Most species took thousands of years to leave their homeworlds. Humans had done it in less than 200 years. Still, they were weak. Everyone knew that. They lived for less than 100 years. Most intelligent species lived for at least 500 years. Humans were also small and soft. They had no natural weapons like claws or poison. Their technology was basic compared to the great powers of the galaxy. Zethkar read through the files about humans. They came from a world called Earth. It was mostly water, which seemed wasteful. They had fought many wars among themselves before they learned to travel between stars. This was normal. Most species did the same thing. What was unusual was how quickly they had developed. Most species spent thousands of years fighting with simple weapons. Humans went from throwing rocks to flying between stars in just a few thousand years. This was very fast, but it probably meant they were not very wise. Fast growth usually meant poor planning. The current situation was simple. Humans had built some colonies on planets near Krillian space. The Krillians were an old and powerful empire. They had been conquering smaller species for thousands of years. Now they wanted the planets that humans had settled on. It should be over quickly. The Krillians had hundreds of ships. Humans had maybe 20 ships in the area. The Krillians had weapons that could destroy entire cities. Human weapons were much weaker. The Krillians had been fighting wars since before humans learned to use fire. Zethkar's job was to watch the battle and write a report. The Galactic Council wanted to know how humans fought. Every species had different ways of fighting. Some were very logical and calculated. Others were wild and emotional. Most fell somewhere in between. The Veltari, Zethkar's own species, fought with pure logic. They calculated odds, analyzed enemy weaknesses, and struck with mathematical precision. Emotions were kept out of military decisions. This made them very effective. It also made their reports very accurate. Zethkar moved his ship to a good watching position. He was far enough away that no one would see him, but close enough to record everything. His instruments could pick up radio signals, heat signatures, and energy readings from both fleets. The human fleet was already in the system. Zethkar counted their ships. 18 combat vessels and about 30 civilian ships. The civilian ships were probably refugees from the colonies. This made sense. When you cannot win a fight, you save who you can. The ships were arranged in a defensive formation around the civilian vessels. This was logical. Protect the non-combatants while planning your retreat. Zethkar approved of this strategy. It showed that humans were not completely stupid. The Krillian fleet appeared at the edge of the system. Zethkar's instruments counted over 200 ships. The smallest Krillian ship was larger than the biggest human ship. Some of the Krillian vessels were massive dreadnoughts that could probably destroy the entire human fleet by themselves. Zethkar began recording everything. His report would be thorough and detailed. The Council would want to know exactly how humans behaved when facing impossible odds. Most species either surrendered immediately or ran away as fast as possible. A few fought desperately for a short time before being destroyed. The Krillian commander sent a message to the humans. Zethkar's equipment picked it up easily. The message was simple. Surrender now and you will be allowed to leave the system. Refuse and everyone dies. Zethkar waited for the human response. It should come quickly. When facing a much stronger enemy, the smart choice was obvious. Save your people and find somewhere else to live. These planets were not worth dying for. The human response came after 10 minutes. This was longer than expected. Maybe they needed time to argue among themselves. Some humans probably wanted to surrender while others wanted to fight. Eventually, logic would win. The message from the humans was short. We refuse your demand. These are our homes. We will defend them. Zethkar blinked all 4 of his eyes in surprise. This was not logical. The humans had no chance of winning. Their ships were outnumbered 10 to 1. Their weapons were weaker. Their armor was thinner. Fighting would only result in everyone dying for nothing. Maybe they were bluffing. Maybe they thought the Krillians would respect their courage and offer better terms. This sometimes worked with younger species. The Krillians, however, were very old and very experienced. They had heard every bluff before. The Krillian commander's response was immediate. "You have chosen death. We will grant your wish." The Krillian fleet began moving forward. They arranged themselves in a classic attack formation. The big ships would use their long-range weapons to weaken the human defenses. Then the smaller, faster ships would move in to finish the job. Zethkar watched the human fleet. They should be panicking now. They should be sending desperate messages to their homeworlds, asking for help that would never come. They should be arguing about whether it was too late to surrender. Instead, the human ships moved into a tighter defensive formation. They positioned themselves directly between the Krillians and the civilian ships. This was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. Zethkar noticed something strange. The human ships were sending signals to each other, but they were not military signals. They were personal messages. Soldiers were talking to their families. Ship captains were recording final messages for their children. This was unusual. Most species saved personal communications for after the battle. Humans seemed to think they were definitely going to die, yet they were not trying to escape. They were not surrendering. They were just accepting it. The first shots were fired by the Krillians. Massive energy beams reached across space and struck the outer human ships. The human shields flared and held, but barely. The next shots would probably break through. The humans fired back. Their weapons were much smaller, but they aimed well. Several Krillian ships took damage. It was not serious damage, but it was more than the Krillians had expected from such primitive weapons. What surprised Zethkar was how the humans coordinated their attacks. They did not target the biggest ships or the most dangerous weapons. Instead, they aimed for specific weak points that would cause maximum damage with minimum energy. This required very detailed knowledge of Krillian ship design. The battle continued. More human ships were destroyed or badly damaged. The Krillians kept advancing. But something was wrong. The Krillian advance was slower than it should be. They were being more careful than usual. Zethkar realized why. The humans were not fighting like a weaker species. They were not making desperate, panicked attacks. Every shot was carefully planned. Every movement had a purpose. They fought like they had been studying Krillian tactics for years. This was impossible. Humans had never fought the Krillians before. They should know nothing about Krillian military strategies. Yet they seemed to predict every Krillian move. As Zethkar watched, he began to feel something he had never felt before while observing a battle. He felt nervous. Not for his own safety. His ship was perfectly hidden and protected. He felt nervous about what he was seeing. These humans were not fighting like any species he had ever observed. They were not trying to win because winning was impossible. They were not trying to escape because escape was not their goal. They were fighting for something else entirely, something that Zethkar did not understand, something that made him very uncomfortable. The battle had been going on for 3 hours. Zethkar watched as another human ship exploded under Krillian fire. That made 7 human ships destroyed so far. The Krillians had lost only 2 ships, and those were just damaged, not destroyed. By all military logic, the humans should surrender now. They had lost more than a third of their fleet. The civilian ships they were protecting were taking damage from long-range weapons. Continuing to fight would only make things worse, but the humans kept fighting. What disturbed Zethkar was not that they kept fighting. Many species fought to the end when they had no choice. What disturbed him was how they fought. He watched a human destroyer called the Memphis Belle get surrounded by 4 Krillian ships. The logical thing to do was to surrender or at least try to escape. Instead, the Memphis Belle turned and charged directly at the largest Krillian ship. Zethkar's instruments picked up radio chatter from the human ship. The captain was not screaming orders or panicking. Instead, he was talking calmly to his crew. Set course for the Krillian command ship. All power to engines. Evacuate the rear sections and seal the bulkheads. The crew responded without question. No arguments, no panic. They just did what they were told, even though they knew it meant death. The Memphis Belle crashed into the Krillian command ship at full speed. Both ships exploded in a massive fireball. Zethkar had seen many ship-to-ship crashes before, but never one that was planned and deliberate. The other human ships did not mourn their lost comrades. They did not pause to honor the dead. They just kept fighting, as if losing a ship and its entire crew was normal. This was not normal behavior for any species Zethkar had studied. He focused his instruments on another human ship, a cruiser called Defiant. It was badly damaged and surrounded by enemy ships. The logical choice was to surrender and save the crew's lives. Instead, Zethkar watched the ship turn to face a Krillian transport that was carrying invasion troops toward one of the human colonies. The transport was heavily protected, but the human captain seemed determined to attack it anyway. The radio chatter from the Defiant was strange. The crew was not talking about tactics or weapons. They were talking about the colony below them, about the families who lived there, about children who went to school there, about farmers who grew food there. "There are 3 million people down there," the captain said over the radio, "including my daughter and her kids. I've never met my grandchildren. I'm not going to let these monsters hurt them." The Defiant attacked the transport ship. It was a suicide run, just like the Memphis Belle. But before the ship was destroyed, it managed to damage the transport badly enough that it had to retreat. Zethkar made notes in his report. Human ships deliberately sacrifice themselves to achieve tactical objectives. Crew members appear to accept death without question when ordered. Motivation appears to be protection of civilian populations rather than military victory. But even as he wrote these words, Zethkar knew they did not explain what he was seeing. He had watched many species fight to protect their civilians, but those species fought with desperation, with fear, with the hope that somehow they might survive. Humans fought with something else, something that Zethkar could not identify or understand. He turned his attention to a group of human fighters that were trying to protect a damaged civilian transport. The transport was full of refugees from one of the colonies. It was moving slowly because its engines were damaged. 6 Krillian fighters were closing in on the transport. They would destroy it easily. The human fighters knew this. There were only 3 of them, and their ships were much smaller than the Krillian fighters. The logical thing to do was to retreat and save themselves. The transport was probably doomed anyway. Instead, the human fighters positioned themselves between the Krillians and the transport. They spread out in a defensive formation that would make it harder for the Krillians to get past them. Zethkar listened to their radio chatter. He expected to hear fear, desperation, maybe prayers to whatever gods humans believed in. Instead, he heard laughter. "Well, boys," one of the pilots said, "looks like this is it. Anyone got any last words?" "Yeah," another pilot replied. "Tell my wife I kept my promise." "What promise?" the third pilot asked. "I promised to come home safe," the second pilot said. "I never said anything about coming home alive." All 3 pilots laughed at this. They laughed as they flew toward certain death. Zethkar did not understand this at all. Why were they laughing? Death was not funny. Death was the end of everything. Death was failure. The human fighters attacked the Krillian ships. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with incredible skill. They used tactics that Zethkar had never seen before. They worked together like parts of a single machine. 2 of the human fighters were destroyed quickly. The third fighter was badly damaged, but it kept fighting. It managed to destroy 1 Krillian fighter and damage 2 others before it was finally shot down. The remaining Krillian fighters went after the transport. But the delay caused by the human fighters had given the transport time to reach the protection of the main human fleet. The civilian ship was saved. 3 human pilots had died to save a ship full of refugees they had never met. Zethkar tried to understand this. In his culture, the Veltari culture, decisions were made based on logic and mathematics. You weighed the costs against the benefits. You chose the option that gave the best results for the most people. But humans seemed to operate on different principles. They made decisions based on what? Emotion? Duty? Something else? He watched another incident that made even less sense. A human medical ship was trying to rescue survivors from a destroyed warship. The medical ship was unarmed and unarmored. It was clearly marked with medical symbols. The Krillians attacked it anyway. This was against galactic law, but the Krillians had never cared much about laws. The medical ship was defenseless. It should have fled immediately. Instead, it kept working. The medical crew kept pulling survivors out of the wreckage, even as Krillian weapons fired at them. One of the human warships saw what was happening. It broke away from its position in the defensive line and rushed to protect the medical ship. This left a gap in the human defenses that the Krillians immediately exploited. The warship managed to drive off the Krillian attackers, but the cost was high. The gap in the defensive line allowed 3 Krillian ships to get through and attack the civilian transports directly. From a military standpoint, this was a terrible decision. The warship had weakened the entire defensive line to save 1 medical ship. The logical choice would have been to let the medical ship be destroyed and keep the defensive line intact, but humans did not seem to think logically about these things. Zethkar watched the medical ship complete its rescue mission. It had saved 43 survivors from the destroyed warship. Meanwhile, the civilian transports that were attacked because of the gap in the defensive line had lost over 200 people. The mathematics were clear. The human commander had made the wrong choice. 43 lives were not worth 200 lives. But as Zethkar watched the rescued survivors being treated on the medical ship, he realized that humans probably did not see it that way. To humans, apparently, abandoning the medical ship would have been wrong regardless of the mathematics. This was deeply disturbing to Zethkar. How could a species survive if they made military decisions based on emotion instead of logic? How could they coordinate their actions if different commanders might make different choices based on their feelings? Yet somehow the human defense was holding. They were losing ships and people, but they were making the Krillians pay a high price for every advance. The Krillian commanders were starting to show signs of frustration. Zethkar had expected this battle to be over quickly. The Krillians should have broken through the human defenses within the first hour. Instead, they were still fighting after 3 hours, and their advance had slowed significantly. The humans were fighting in ways that the Krillians had never encountered before. They used tactics that made no logical sense but somehow worked anyway. They took risks that should have been disasters but somehow turned into victories. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to welcome death as if it were just another tool of war. Zethkar began to understand why his assignment had been given to him. The Galactic Council was not just interested in human military tactics. They were interested in human psychology. They wanted to know what made these creatures tick. Now Zethkar was beginning to wish he had been given a different assignment. Something about watching humans fight was making him very uncomfortable indeed. The battle had been going on for 8 hours now. Zethkar had never seen anything like it. Most space battles lasted 1 or 2 hours at most. After that, one side was clearly winning and the other side either surrendered or was destroyed. But this battle just kept going. The humans had lost 12 of their 18 warships. They were down to 6 combat vessels and the civilian transports they were protecting. By every rule of military logic, they should have been defeated hours ago. Yet somehow they were still fighting. What made it worse for Zethkar was what he was seeing on the individual level. His instruments could pick up personal communications between human ships. He could see the heat signatures of individual people moving around inside the vessels. He could track life signs and medical readings. What he saw terrified him. On one human ship, the Yorktown, a fire had broken out in the engine room. The automatic systems had failed and the fire was spreading toward the main reactor. If it reached the reactor, the entire ship would explode. Zethkar watched as a human engineer named Sarah Chen volunteered to go into the burning engine room to fix the cooling system manually. She knew it was probably a death sentence. The temperature in that room was hot enough to kill a human in minutes, but she went anyway. Zethkar listened to her radio communications as she worked. She was not screaming or crying or begging for help. Instead, she was calmly giving instructions to the other engineers, telling them how to repair the damage after she was gone. "The coupling on Tube 7 is damaged," she said, her voice completely steady despite the fact that she was being cooked alive. "You will need to replace it before you restart the reactor. Make sure you balance the pressure in tubes 3 and 4 first, or the whole system will overload." She worked for 12 minutes before the heat killed her. She never stopped talking. She never stopped giving instructions. She died while explaining how to fix a minor problem with the navigation system. The other engineers followed her instructions exactly. The cooling system was repaired. The ship was saved. Over 300 people lived because one woman decided to walk into a fire. This was not logical behavior. Sarah Chen could have waited for someone else to volunteer. She could have tried to find another solution. She could have argued that the ship was probably doomed anyway. So why die for nothing? Instead, she just did what needed to be done. Zethkar had trouble understanding this. In his culture, self-preservation was the highest logical priority. You could not help others if you were dead. Sacrificing yourself only made sense if it saved more lives than it cost. But humans seem to think differently. They seem to think that some things were more important than staying alive. He watched another incident on a different ship. The Enterprise had been badly damaged and was losing air from multiple holes in the hull. The crew was working desperately to seal the holes before everyone suffocated. One of the holes was in a section that had been cut off from the rest of the ship. A human named Marcus Webb was trapped in that section. The only way to reach him was through a corridor that was already depressurized and full of deadly radiation. The logical thing to do was to write Marcus off as a casualty. One person was not worth risking the entire repair crew, but a human named Lisa Park put on a radiation suit and went after him anyway. The suit would protect her for maybe 10 minutes before the radiation killed her. It would take at least 15 minutes to reach Marcus and bring him back. Zethkar listened to the radio chatter as Lisa made her way through the dangerous corridor. Other crew members were arguing with her, telling her to come back, saying that Marcus was probably dead already. Lisa's response was simple. "He's one of us. We don't leave our people behind." She reached Marcus and found that he was badly injured but still alive. She could have tried to carry him back, but that would have taken too long. The radiation would kill them both before they reached safety. Instead, Lisa used her own oxygen supply to keep Marcus alive while she called for help. She gave him her air, knowing that this meant she would suffocate before rescue arrived. Other crew members, wearing better protection, eventually reached them both. Marcus survived. Lisa died of radiation poisoning 3 hours later. Her last words were, "Tell Marcus it wasn't his fault, and tell him to take care of his kids." Zethkar stared at his instruments, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Lisa Park had died to save one person who was not even her family member or close friend, just a fellow crew member. This was beyond illogical. This was insane. But it got worse. Zethkar watched as the news of Lisa's death spread through the human fleet. He expected to see demoralization, fear, maybe anger at the pointless waste of life. Instead, he saw the opposite. The humans became more determined, not less. They fought harder, not with less enthusiasm. They seemed to draw strength from their losses instead of being weakened by them. On the Constitution, a gunner named Tom Rodriguez had been working his weapon for 6 straight hours without rest. His hands were bleeding from gripping the controls. His eyes were red from staring at targeting screens. He was exhausted and barely conscious. But when he heard about Lisa Park's death, he somehow found new energy. He started firing with even greater accuracy. He destroyed 2 Krillian fighters in the next 10 minutes. When asked why he was pushing himself so hard, Tom's answer was simple. "Lisa died for us. The least I can do is make it count." This pattern repeated throughout the human fleet. Every death seemed to make the survivors fight harder. Every loss seemed to increase their determination. Zethkar could not understand this at all. In every other species he had studied, casualties weakened morale. Soldiers became afraid. Commanders became cautious. Military effectiveness declined as losses mounted. But humans seemed to work in reverse. The more people they lost, the more fiercely they fought. He watched a medical officer named Janet Williams working in the sickbay of the Lexington. She had been operating on wounded soldiers for 7 straight hours. She was exhausted and running out of medical supplies. A Krillian torpedo hit the ship and damaged the medical bay. The lights went out. The air recycling system failed. Smoke began filling the room. The logical thing to do was to evacuate the wounded and set up the medical bay somewhere else. But that would mean moving patients who were too badly injured to be moved. Several of them would die during the evacuation. Janet Williams made a different choice. She stayed in the damaged medical bay and continued operating by the light of a handheld flashlight. She worked in smoke and darkness with barely enough air to breathe because moving her patients would kill them. Other crew members tried to convince her to evacuate. They pointed out that she would die if she stayed. They argued that she could save more lives by setting up a new medical bay somewhere safer. Janet's response was the same as Lisa Park's. "These are my people. I don't abandon my people." She saved 6 lives before the smoke overcame her. She died with a scalpel in her hand, still trying to save one more patient. Zethkar watched this and felt something he had never felt before while observing a military conflict. He felt sick, not physically sick. His species did not react that way to emotional stress. But something inside his mind was rebelling against what he was seeing. These humans were not fighting a war. They were doing something else. Something that had no name in any language Zethikar knew. They were not trying to win. Victory was clearly impossible. They were not trying to survive. They kept choosing death over safer alternatives. They were not even trying to inflict maximum damage on their enemies. They wasted ammunition and energy on protecting people who could not fight back. What were they doing? As Zethikar watched the human fleet continue its impossible resistance, he began to realize that he was seeing something that should not exist. He was watching a species that had somehow evolved beyond the basic survival instincts that governed every other form of intelligent life. These humans valued something more than their own lives. They valued it so much that they would die for it without hesitation. They valued it so much that watching their friends die for it only made them more determined to die for it themselves. What could be worth that much? What could be more important than survival itself? Zethikar did not know, and that terrified him more than anything else he had ever encountered in his long career as an observer of war. 12 hours into the battle, everything changed. Zethikar was monitoring multiple radio frequencies when he detected an emergency signal from the human colony on the planet below. His instruments picked up massive energy readings from the Krillian fleet. Something big was happening. The Krillian commander sent a message to the remaining human ships. Only 3 human warships were still fighting, along with the civilian transports. The message was broadcast on all frequencies so everyone could hear it. Human vessels, you have fought bravely but uselessly. We grow tired of this pointless resistance. You have one choice remaining. Surrender now, or we will deploy a biological weapon against your colony world. Every living thing on that planet will die in agony. The choice is yours. Zethikar checked his instruments. The readings were accurate. The Krillians had loaded biological weapons onto their largest ships. These weapons were banned by galactic law, but the Krillians had used them before when they wanted to make examples of defiant species. The weapon would kill every human on the planet within hours. It was designed to be painful and slow. The Krillians used it to terrorize other species into surrendering without a fight. Zethikar expected the humans to surrender immediately. 3 damaged warships could not protect an entire planet. The logical choice was obvious. Give up the fight and save the 3 million people living on the colony world. The human response came after 5 minutes of silence. We will never surrender. Do what you will. Zethikar could not believe what he was hearing. The humans were choosing to let 3 million of their own people die rather than give up. This was beyond insane. This was pure madness. But then something even more shocking happened. The colony sent its own message to the human fleet. Fleet Command, this is Colonial Governor Martinez. We have heard the Krillian ultimatum. We want you to know that we support your decision. Do not surrender because of us. We knew the risks when we came here. Fight as long as you can. Make them pay for every inch. The colony was telling the fleet not to surrender. The people who would die were supporting the decision that would kill them. Zethikar's mind could not process this. What species would willingly choose death over surrender? What people would ask their protectors to let them die rather than give up? The Krillians deployed their biological weapon. Zethikar watched through his instruments as the deadly virus spread through the colony's atmosphere. Every human on the planet was now infected. They would all be dead within 6 hours. He expected panic. He expected desperate calls for help. He expected the colonists to blame the fleet for letting this happen. Instead, something completely different occurred. The colonists began working. Zethikar watched in confusion as the dying humans organized themselves with military precision. They had 6 hours to live, and they were using that time to fight back. Every factory on the planet began producing weapons and ammunition. Farmers started converting their equipment into military vehicles. Teachers began organizing children into communication networks. Even the sick and elderly were given tasks to help the resistance. The humans were not panicking or crying or praying for rescue. They were turning their entire civilization into a weapon. But the most terrifying part was what they did with the biological weapon itself. Instead of hiding from it or trying to find a cure, the colonists began studying it. Teams of human scientists worked around the clock to analyze the virus. They documented its effects, its transmission methods, its weaknesses, and then they broadcast everything they learned to other human worlds. Zethikar listened to the transmissions with growing horror. The dying humans were creating a detailed guide for fighting biological weapons. They were using their own deaths as a research project. The virus affects the respiratory system first, one scientist reported, even as he was coughing up blood. Wearing basic breathing masks will slow the infection for about 2 hours. Not enough to save you, but enough to keep fighting longer. Another scientist, a woman whose voice was already weak from the disease, added, "The virus is vulnerable to extreme heat. Flamethrowers and incendiary weapons will destroy it in open air. This might help protect other colonies if they use similar weapons against us." They were dying, and they were teaching other humans how to fight the thing that was killing them. But the biological weapon was just the beginning. The Krillians, frustrated by the human resistance, began landing troops on the planet. They wanted to capture key facilities before the virus killed everyone. This was a mistake. The humans had spent their last 6 hours preparing for exactly this scenario. Every building had been turned into a fortress. Every street had become a trap. Every colonist had become a soldier. Zethkar watched as 3-year-old children ran messages between resistance groups. He saw elderly humans in wheelchairs operating communication equipment. He witnessed pregnant women building improvised explosive devices. The Krillian troops found themselves fighting not just human soldiers, but an entire population that had weaponized itself. A human farmer named John Peterson drove his combine harvester directly into a Krillian troop transport. The harvester was not designed for combat, but Peterson had attached explosive charges to it. The explosion destroyed the transport and killed 20 Krillian soldiers. Peterson was 70 years old and already dying from the virus. His last words, broadcast over the radio, were, "That's for my grandson's playground." "You monsters." A human teacher named Maria Santos led a group of teenagers in an attack on a Krillian communication post. They used school chemistry supplies to make smoke bombs and acid grenades. None of them were soldiers. Most of them were dying from the virus. But they destroyed the communication post and prevented the Krillians from coordinating their attacks effectively. Maria died while teaching her students how to make more explosives. Her final lesson was broadcast to other human colonies. "Remember, children, chemistry can be used for more than just science class." The most horrifying incident, from Zethkar's perspective, involved a human hospital. The Krillians attacked it because they thought it would be an easy target. Hospitals were usually protected by galactic law, and the patients inside would be too weak to fight. They were wrong on both counts. The human patients, many of them dying from the virus, had organized themselves into a defensive force. Doctors and nurses had distributed weapons to anyone who could hold them. Even patients who could barely stand were manning defensive positions. When the Krillians broke into the hospital, they found themselves fighting cancer patients with rifles, elderly humans with grenade launchers, and children with improvised weapons. The hospital's chief of surgery, Dr. Rebecca Stone, continued performing operations even as the battle raged around her. She was operating on a wounded resistance fighter while Krillian soldiers were shooting at her from across the room. "I took an oath to do no harm," she said calmly over the radio as bullets flew past her head. "But that doesn't mean I can't fight while I'm saving lives." She completed the surgery successfully, then picked up a rifle and joined the defense of the hospital. The Krillians eventually retreated from the hospital after losing half their assault force. They had expected to face helpless patients. Instead, they had fought the most determined defenders they had ever encountered. By the time the virus finished its work, every human on the planet was dead. But they had taken over 4,000 Krillian soldiers with them. More importantly, they had broadcast detailed information about Krillian weapons, tactics, and weaknesses to every human world in the galaxy. The Krillians had won the battle, but they had lost something much more valuable: their psychological advantage. Other species would now know that humans did not fear death. They would know that humans could turn any defeat into a lesson for future victories. Zethkar watched the final transmission from the dying colony. It came from Governor Martinez, who was barely alive but still at his post. "To all human worlds," the governor said, his voice weak but clear, "we are gone, but you are not. Learn from our deaths. Use what we discovered. And remember, they can kill us, but they cannot make us surrender. We chose this. We chose to fight. And if you ever face the same choice, we hope you will choose as we did." The transmission ended. 3 million humans were dead, and somehow, Zethkar knew that the Krillians had just made the worst mistake in their long history. They had taught humans that biological weapons could be studied, analyzed, and defeated. They had shown other human colonies exactly what they were willing to do. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that even total victory against humans came at a cost that might not be worth paying. Zethkar looked at his instruments and realized that he was no longer just observing a battle between two species. He was watching the birth of something new and terrifying. He was watching humans learn how to turn death itself into a weapon. The battle officially ended 3 days after the colony died. The last human warship, the Defiant, had been fighting alone for 18 hours after its sister ships were destroyed. It was barely holding together. Its hull was cracked in dozens of places. Its weapons were almost out of ammunition. Its crew was down to 12 people. The Krillian commander offered surrender terms one final time. "Human vessel, you have fought well, but it is over. Surrender now and we will allow your crew to live as prisoners." The response from the Defiant's captain came immediately. "Krillian vessel, this is Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth ship Defiant. We do not surrender. We do not retreat. And we do not forget. See you in hell." The Defiant turned toward the largest Krillian ship and accelerated to ramming speed. It was the same tactic Zethkar had seen dozens of times during this battle. Humans always chose to take their enemies with them rather than give up. But this time was different. This time, Zethkar was listening to the internal communications of the Krillian fleet. For the first time in the battle, he heard something in Krillian voices that he had never heard before. Fear. "Commander, the human ship is approaching at attack speed," a Krillian officer reported. His voice was shaking. "Should we destroy it?" There was a long pause before the Krillian commander responded. "Yes, destroy it before it reaches us, but be careful. These humans are not normal." The Krillians destroyed the Defiant before it could ram their ship. The last human warship exploded in a ball of fire and metal. The battle was over. The Krillians had won a complete victory. They had destroyed the entire human fleet. They had killed every colonist on the planet. They had taken control of the star system, but Zethkar could tell from their communications that they did not feel like victors. "Sir," a Krillian officer said to his commander, "what are your orders? Should we begin colonization of the planet?" The commander was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. "No, mark this system as a dead zone. We will not colonize it, sir. But the planet has valuable resources. The mining rights alone would—" "I said no," the commander snapped. "This place is cursed. I will not ask our people to live where those creatures died. Mark it as a memorial and let's leave." Zethkar was puzzled by this response. The Krillians had never shown respect for defeated enemies before. They usually strip-mined conquered worlds and turned them into industrial centers. Why were they treating this human world differently? Over the next few hours, as the Krillian fleet prepared to leave the system, Zethkar monitored their internal communications. What he heard explained everything. The Krillian soldiers were traumatized. "I've been in dozens of battles," one soldier said to another. "I've seen many species fight and die, but I've never seen anything like this. These humans, they fought like demons. Even when they were dying, they kept fighting." Another soldier responded, "Did you see what they did in the hospital? Children with weapons, old people building bombs, pregnant females fighting to the death. What kind of species does that?" "The worst part," a third soldier added, "was how they looked at us when they were dying. They weren't afraid. They weren't begging for mercy. They were happy, like they had accomplished something by dying. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen." The conversations continued like this throughout the fleet. Hardened Krillian warriors, veterans of hundreds of battles, were shaken by what they had witnessed. But the most telling conversation came from the Krillian command ship. Zethkar listened as the fleet commander spoke with his senior officers. "Sir," one officer said, "the casualties were much higher than expected. We lost over 6,000 soldiers in this operation. That's more than we usually lose conquering entire star systems." The commander nodded grimly. "I know, and for what? One small colony and a handful of primitive warships. The cost was too high. Should we report this to High Command?" another officer asked. The commander thought for a moment. "Yes, but carefully. I want to recommend that we avoid further conflicts with humans if possible. These creatures are unnatural. They don't follow the normal rules of warfare. What do you mean, sir? The commander struggled to find the right words. Every other species we've conquered has had limits. Points where they would break, where self-preservation would override their fighting spirit. But these humans, they have no limits. They will die for anything. They will sacrifice everything for the smallest tactical advantage. They turn every defeat into a lesson for their survivors. He paused, staring out at the dead planet below them. Most importantly, they make you pay for every victory. Even when you win, you lose. I don't think the Empire can afford many more victories like this one. Zethkar realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. A military force so feared and powerful that they had terrorized entire sectors of the galaxy was now afraid of humans. Not because humans were stronger or more advanced. The Krillians had won this battle easily from a technical standpoint, but because humans had demonstrated something that no other species had ever shown. They were willing to pay any price for their principles. Over the following weeks, as Zethkar continued to monitor galactic communications, he saw the effects of this battle spreading throughout known space. The story of the human colony's last stand was broadcast on every major news network. Other species watched the recordings with a mixture of awe and horror. The images of dying humans teaching their children to make weapons, of doctors performing surgery while under fire, of entire populations choosing death over surrender, became the most watched content in galactic history. But more importantly, Zethkar saw how other human colonies reacted to the news. They did not panic. They did not despair. They did not beg for protection from more powerful species. Instead, they began preparing. Every human world started building defenses based on the lessons learned from the dead colony. They studied the tactical information broadcast by the dying scientists. They implemented the defensive strategies developed by the colonists during their final 6 hours. Most disturbing of all, they began training their children. Zethkar watched through long-range sensors as human schools started teaching military tactics alongside mathematics and literature. He saw children as young as 5 learning how to make improvised weapons and explosives. He witnessed teenagers practicing urban warfare techniques and guerrilla tactics. The humans were not just preparing to fight. They were preparing to fight the way the dead colonists had fought, with total commitment, absolute fearlessness, and the willingness to turn every defeat into a victory for their survivors. Within 6 months, intelligence reports from across the galaxy confirmed what Zethkar had suspected. Other species were beginning to avoid human space. Trade routes were being rerouted. Expansion plans were being cancelled. The Galactic Council received a formal request from the Krillian Empire, asking for mediation in their conflict with humanity. The Krillians, who had never asked for help in their entire history, were requesting assistance in dealing with a species they had already defeated. Zethkar finally completed his report. It was the longest and most detailed military analysis he had ever written. But as he prepared to submit it to the Galactic Council, he realized that he could not bring himself to send it. The report contained information that was too dangerous to share. It explained exactly how humans fought, how they thought, how they turned their apparent weaknesses into terrifying strengths. If other species read this report, they might decide that humans were too dangerous to be allowed to exist. They might try to destroy humanity before it could spread further into the galaxy. Or worse, they might try to copy human tactics. They might try to create their own versions of human soldiers, beings with no fear of death, no concept of surrender, no limits on what they would sacrifice for their beliefs. Zethkar deleted the report. Instead, he wrote a much shorter document. It contained only one recommendation. After extensive observation of human military capabilities, I strongly advise that all galactic powers avoid armed conflict with this species. Recommend immediate classification of human space as a restricted zone. Suggest peaceful contact only with extreme caution. He submitted this brief report and requested immediate reassignment to a different sector of the galaxy, preferably one as far from human space as possible. His request was approved within hours. As Zethkar's ship left the system where he had watched humans fight and die, he made one final observation in his personal log. I was ordered to watch humans in battle. I have seen what happens when a species evolves warfare not from conquest or survival, but from love. Love for their families, their homes, their principles, their fellow humans. This love makes them willing to pay any price, accept any loss, endure any suffering. I have seen the future of warfare, and it terrifies me. If humans ever become truly angry, if they ever decide that another species threatens everything they love, that species will not survive. Not because humans are stronger or more advanced, but because they will never stop, never surrender, never give up. They will turn their entire civilization into a weapon. They will teach their children to die for victory. They will make every defeat into a lesson for their survivors.